I'm Danielle Brooks, 35 years old, and last Christmas, I truly believed that hosting dinner in my new home just outside Portland, Oregon, would finally change everything. Not my job, not my income, but the one thing I'd been quietly chasing my whole life, my family's respect. If you've ever found yourself giving more than you had, just to be seen or valued, please like, subscribe, and share this story. Someone out there needs to hear it. Maybe it's you. It had taken me almost 15 years to get here. Countless late nights, holidays spent alone at the office, saving every bonus, skipping every trip. Also, I could one day own a home. A little 3-bedroom house with a working fireplace, tall windows, and enough space for a family that had never really made room for me. I closed on the house in June. By July, I was planning Christmas. That's when the call came. My mother, Lorraine, on the other end of the line, voice trembling. "There's mold in the bathroom walls," she said. "The insurance won't cover it. Brandon can't help. I don't know what I'm going to do." I had just drained my savings for the down payment, but I told her, "Don't worry, Mom, I'll cover it." I transferred what I could from my investment account, a number that still makes my chest tighten when I think about it. "You've always been the reliable one," she said after I sent the money. Reliable, like a flashlight or a faucet. Still, I told myself it was worth it, that this year would be different. I spent 3 weeks preparing. Decorations, menus, gifts, everything. I wanted the house to feel like love, like belonging, like proof that I wasn't just dependable, I was important. I hung garlands across the banister, framed old family photos, bought my mother a cashmere sweater in her favorite shade of blue. I even tracked down a limited edition art tablet Brandon had once mentioned offhand. This wasn't about money. It was about creating a Christmas where maybe, for once, I wouldn't feel like a background character. That morning, as I basted the turkey in my apron, the kitchen grew warm. I cracked open the window over the sink to let in a breeze. And that's when I heard it. Their voices floated in from the patio, my mother's, my brother's. What I heard in the next few minutes would undo everything I'd built in silence, everything I'd sacrificed. But before we get to that moment, I need you to understand how much I'd given, how deep the roots of this story run, because betrayal doesn't strike hardest when it's cruel. It strikes hardest when it's quiet, when it wears the face of the people you love. What I heard through that window would change everything, but to explain why it hurt so much, you have to understand what came before it. Growing up, I was never the loud one, not the funny one, not the golden child. I was the girl who knew how to keep things running. My parents divorced when I was 15. That was the year my mom stopped really showing up, and I started picking up the pieces. Brandon was just 8. He had asthma, night terrors, and a natural gift for making people laugh. Everyone called him the heart of the family. He was sunshine. I was scaffolding. While he went to after-school art classes and summer camps, I was learning how to budget, how to cook dinner from whatever was left in the fridge, how to pretend I wasn't drowning in resentment. No one ever asked how I was doing. They just assumed I was fine because I always looked like I was holding it together. When I got into the University of Oregon on a full scholarship, I cried in the hallway outside the admissions office. Not out of joy, out of exhaustion. I'd held down 2 part-time jobs during high school. I skipped prom to work a closing shift at the diner. I never told anyone how many nights I lay awake wondering what it would feel like to just be a kid. I never found out. Brandon, on the other hand, was allowed to find himself. He switched majors 3 times, lived off Mom's credit cards, and still managed to be the hero of every story she told at family dinners. "You know your brother has such a creative soul," she'd say, beaming. What did I have? A 3.9 GPA and no one at my graduation. But despite all that, I still wanted to believe that love was possible, that my sacrifices hadn't gone unnoticed. So I kept giving. And giving. I helped pay off Brandon's car loan after he totaled the first one. I covered the vet bill when Mom's cat needed emergency surgery. Every time there was a crisis, I showed up, not because I had to, but because part of me kept hoping this time would be different, that someone would look me in the eyes and say, "Thank you, Danielle. We see you. And that's what made this Christmas so important. It wasn't just a holiday, it was my offering. My way of saying, here I am, I've built something, I've made space for all of us. Please, meet me here. That's why I spent so much, why I stayed up till 2 a.m. wrapping gifts with ribbons and handwritten cards, why I searched hours online for that art tablet Brandon had offhandedly mentioned, why I bought my mom that spa package, because she deserved something nice. I wasn't trying to buy their love, I was trying to remind them I existed. And as I stood in that kitchen with the cold air brushing my cheek and the voices drifting up from the patio, I knew that everything I'd done, the money, the meals, the memories, I hadn't built a bridge. I'd built a stage, and I was the only one who didn't know I was being used. I didn't say anything that night, not when they came inside with cold fingers and cheerful chatter, not when my mom complimented the roast turkey or Brandon held up his wine glass like nothing in the world was wrong, because part of me still wanted to believe maybe I'd misunderstood. Maybe they didn't mean it the way it sounded. Maybe I was just tired, overworked, emotional. But denial, I've learned, is just grief in disguise. December 23rd was a whirlwind. I woke up early, determined to finish my gift shopping. I told myself I needed the distraction. Something about the chaos of holiday crowds felt easier to manage than the quiet weight in my chest. I fought through the mess of Westfield Mall, searching for that perfect balance of meaning and extravagance. For my mom, I bought a silk robe from the boutique she always window shopped but never entered. For Brandon, I upgraded the tablet to the newest model, even though the price made my stomach twist. I even got something for his girlfriend Jess, who I'd only met once on a Zoom call, a hand-poured candle from a local artisan shop. Lavender and bergamot. Calming, like I wished someone had gifted me years ago. As I lugged bags to the car, my arms aching and the wind slicing through my coat, I tried to picture Christmas morning. I imagined their faces lighting up. I imagined Brandon saying, "Wow, Danny, you didn't have to do all this." I imagined Mom tearing up, touched by how thoughtful I'd been. I imagined a moment that felt like family, not because I needed validation, but because I'd built this life on the hope that if I just gave enough, loved enough, I could fill the void they never acknowledged. That night, I called my best friend Tasha. She's the kind of person who knows your heart before you speak it. I went overboard again, I admitted, curling up on the couch with tea I couldn't finish. "Of course you did," she said gently, "because you think if you make things perfect, they'll finally show up for you." "I don't expect perfection," I said, though we both knew I wasn't being honest. "I just want it to feel real. This year feels different." There was a long pause. Then she said softly, "You say that every year, Danny." And she wasn't wrong. Every Christmas, I hoped it would be the one where my mom noticed how hard I worked, where Brandon said, "Thanks," where I wasn't just a name on their gift tags or a reliable source of help, but someone they actually cherished. And every year, I walked away carrying something heavier than the presents I gave. But I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. I still had hope. I still had dinner to cook. I still had one more day. By Christmas Eve morning, I was running on caffeine and adrenaline, and a flicker of belief that maybe, somehow, this could still be salvaged. I'd already heard what I wasn't supposed to, but I hadn't confronted them. Not yet, because part of me still wanted the illusion, even if it was fragile, even if it was fading. I woke at 5:30 a.m., too wired to sleep. The sky was still dark outside my kitchen window, Portland fog curling low over the streetlights like breath on glass. I lit a cinnamon candle and turned on some quiet jazz. Then I got to work. Roast turkey, lemon herb stuffing, scalloped potatoes, sautéed green beans with almonds, spiced cranberry sauce, dinner rolls from scratch, 3 kinds of pie. Everything my grandmother used to make before arthritis stole her hands. Cooking had always been my ritual, my peace. It was where I could control something, even when nothing else felt certain. As I chopped and stirred, I imagined my mom taking a bite and saying, "This tastes just like Grandma's." I imagined Brandon actually asking for the recipe. I imagined laughter, not tension, connection, not calculation. By late morning, my kitchen looked like a scene out of a Hallmark movie. If Hallmark movies came with burned fingertips, flour-dusted hair, and aching feet. The turkey was already roasting, and the house smelled like cloves, rosemary, and hope. At 11:30, the doorbell rang, and just like that, my carefully managed dream began to crack. My mom walked in first, dressed in a navy pantsuit that probably cost more than my entire month's mortgage. Her hair was freshly styled, makeup flawless, her expression unreadable. "The house looks cozy," she said, offering an air kiss instead of a hug. Although I personally prefer neutral lights over multicolored ones, more tasteful. Before I could respond, Brandon strolled in behind her, a duffel bag over one shoulder. He wore a denim jacket and that permanent smirk he used when he wanted to seem charming but never had to try too hard. "Wow, Danny," he said, glancing around the living room. "This is very suburban chic of you. Did you always have a thing for snowflake garland?" I smiled tightly. "Just trying to keep some of Grandma's traditions alive." "Cute," he said with a shrug, clearly not listening. Their words weren't cruel, but they weren't warm either. Everything felt slightly performative, polished, distant. That's the thing about emotional manipulation. It rarely announces itself loudly. It creeps in softly, like a draft under a door, making you question if it's even there. A few hours later, Jess arrived with a bottle of wine and a well-practiced smile. She actually hugged me, which almost made me tear up. "You've done so much, Danielle," she whispered. "This place is beautiful." Those words shouldn't have hit me as hard as they did. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of small talk, passive remarks, and distracted scrolling on phones. Brandon flopped on my couch and barely looked up. Mom paced between rooms, commenting on my table settings and placement of candles. "Lunch will just be soup and sandwiches," I said at one point. "I want everyone to be hungry for dinner." "Smart," Mom replied. "I've been watching my carbs anyway." It wasn't about the soup, or the lights, or the garland. It was about the slow erosion of effort, about knowing you've given everything to people who will never see it as enough. And still, I tried. I kept stirring, kept smiling, kept believing, until that window opened again. And this time, I heard everything. The scent of rosemary and roasted turkey filled the air as I leaned over the stove, basting the golden skin with butter and garlic. The kitchen was warm, too warm, and my forehead glistened under the strain of a day that had already drained me emotionally. I needed air. So I unlatched the window above the sink and pushed it open, letting a crisp December breeze roll in. That's when I heard them. They were out back on the patio, my mom and Brandon. I hadn't even realized they'd stepped outside. I was about to call out and offer them cider when I heard my name. "I can't believe we're spending Christmas with that woman," Brandon muttered, his voice thick with annoyance. My hand froze over the turkey. My breath caught in my throat. "Just until she finishes paying off the bathroom," Mom replied, her voice low but clear. "The contractor's still waiting for the second payment. Danielle promised she'd handle it." Brandon laughed, a sharp, mean sound I'd never heard from him before. "She actually believed we needed 50 grand for mold? That bathroom reno didn't even break 30. "Exactly," Mom answered. "The rest is going toward your photography equipment for the trip. And if she keeps thinking she's finally earning her place in this family, she'll fund the whole thing without blinking." My grip tightened on the baster. My knees nearly buckled. Surely I'd misheard. Surely there was some context I was missing. But then Brandon added, "Honestly, the way she clings to every compliment, it's embarrassing. She's still trying to win your approval at 35 like it's Girl Scouts." And Mom, my mother, laughed. "She's always been like that," she said. "Useful, not lovable, but she serves her purpose." I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My ears were ringing, but every word kept slicing clean and deep. Useful, not lovable. How many times had I stayed up at night designing spreadsheets for Mom's taxes? How many birthdays had I covered when Brandon forgot? How many weekends had I canceled plans just to show up, fix things, fund things, hold things together? And this is how they talked about me, behind my back, in my home. I closed the window slowly, the cool air now burning against my skin. Nothing had changed, not really. I was still the responsible one. Still the fixer, still the fool holding on to hope like it was a lifeline instead of a leash. But something broke inside me that afternoon, a quiet, irrevocable crack in the foundation I'd spent decades building. And once it broke, I knew there would be no patching it back together. Not this time. I didn't cry right away. I didn't throw the baster or scream into the empty kitchen. I didn't confront them or storm outside. I did what I always did. I kept going. I turned down the heat on the turkey, stirred the cranberry sauce like it hadn't just become meaningless, wiped flour from the counter like my hands weren't shaking. But something in me had shifted. Their laughter still echoed in my head, sharp and cruel. Useful, not lovable. The words circled like crows above a field of all my efforts, all my hopes. And yet, habit is hard to break. I told myself I'd deal with it later. I told myself to focus on dinner, to focus on guests, on appearances, on keeping the holiday together, because that's what I was best at, wasn't it? Keeping things together that were never meant to hold. I was frosting a pecan pie when I heard the back door close. Footsteps approached the kitchen. I didn't look up. "Something smells amazing in here," Mom said, her voice bright and syrupy. "You always were the best cook in the family. Must be from my side." I forced a nod. "Dinner's at 6. Brandon wandered in behind her and grabbed a cookie from the tray. "They could use more nutmeg," he muttered. Before, that comment would have stung. Now? It barely landed, like a pebble tossed into a canyon, already echoing with bigger wounds. Jess offered to help set the table, and for once, I didn't protest. Her presence was the only thing grounding me. When she smiled and asked, "Red or white napkins?" I nearly choked on gratitude. I watched her move through my dining room with ease, kindness without agenda. It reminded me that not everyone took. Some people simply gave. By the time the table was fully set, candles lit, crystal glasses gleaming, the turkey resting under foil, my body was operating on autopilot. But my mind was wide awake. Everything they'd said outside played again and again in my head. The $50,000 lie, the mockery, the plan to funnel my money into Brandon's travel gear, my mother's complete lack of hesitation. And the worst part? They weren't even sorry. They didn't even try to hide it. We sat for dinner. The food looked perfect, the kind of table you'd see on a magazine cover. And yet every bite tasted like ash. Mom complimented the stuffing. Brandon said the rolls were fine. Jess praised every dish like it was a gift, because she understood what effort actually meant. But none of it mattered, because I knew what was coming. The ask, the pitch, the moment where they'd smile and pretend to care just long enough to reach into my wallet again. And this time, I wouldn't be ready with a check. I'd be ready with the truth. I sat through dinner with a practiced smile, the kind I'd mastered after years of swallowing disappointment like vitamins. My mother asked about my job, just enough to sound polite, not enough to actually care. Brandon made a toast with half-hearted charm, and Jess, bless her, tried her best to keep things light. But under the flickering glow of candles and the scent of roasted garlic, I was unraveling quietly. Because now I knew. I wasn't feeding my family, I was feeding a performance. A script they had written. One where I always footed the bill, and they always played along just long enough to collect. Halfway through dessert, it began. "So," Brandon said casually, cutting into his slice of pumpkin pie, "I've been working on this idea. A small photography business. Online gallery, freelance bookings, the whole thing." Mom chimed in like it was spontaneous. "He's really talented, Danielle. You should see some of the shots he's taken. Honestly, with the right startup help, he could really go somewhere." There it was, the ask, wrapped in flattery, dressed like potential. I reached for the pie server, my hand calm, my voice calmer. What would the startup help be going toward? Brandon blinked. You know, equipment, website, stuff like that. Stuff, I repeated. That's a pretty broad business category. He chuckled nervously. Well, it's still evolving. I looked at my mother. She was sipping wine but watching me closely. And the bathroom renovation? I asked. She raised a perfectly drawn-on brow. What about it? Any updates from the contractor? Receipts? Progress photos? The room shifted. Jess looked between us, sensing tension. Mom set down her glass. Danielle, are you interrogating us at Christmas? I'm asking questions, I said softly, because this time I need answers. I glanced around the table, at the decorations I had arranged, the meal I had poured myself into, the people who had sat at this table pretending love while plotting gain. And for the first time in years, I let the silence stretch. I let it sting. Brandon finally cleared his throat. You're being really weird right now. Like, defensive. It's Christmas. No, Brandon, I said. What's weird is lying to someone who's always had your back. His mouth opened, then shut again. Mom shifted in her chair. Let's not turn this into a scene. You mean the kind of scene where I find out half the renovation budget went toward a camera lens and a flight to Mexico? Jess's fork clattered onto her plate. The room went quiet, except for the sound of my breath, steady, even, controlled. I wasn't yelling. I wasn't crying. I was just done. Excuse me, I said, rising from the table. I need some air. I walked back to the kitchen, back to the window, the same one that had shattered the illusion. And as I stood there, this time not to escape the heat but to breathe again, I realized the confrontation had only just begun. I stood at the kitchen window, both hands braced against the counter, trying to steady the shaking that had now reached my ribs. The same air that had chilled me hours ago now felt strangely warm, like the tension inside me had raised the temperature of the entire house. I stared into the dark backyard, the patio where they had laughed at me just that morning now cloaked in shadows and silence. I had spent my entire life being careful with my words, careful not to rock the boat, careful not to make anyone uncomfortable, even if it meant abandoning myself. But something in me was breaking through the surface now, louder than guilt, older than fear. It wasn't rage. It was recognition. Recognition that I'd been raised not to question. Recognition that silence had been my loyalty. Recognition that every sacrifice I'd made had been repackaged as obligation. I turned back toward the living room. They were still seated around the table, plates half full, tension thick in the air. I walked slowly, deliberately. Danielle, my mom said, the faux concern already creeping back into her voice. Let's not ruin a perfectly good evening with misunderstandings. I looked straight at her. There's no misunderstanding. Brandon muttered something, but I cut him off. Let's get something clear, I said, my voice low but steady. I heard you this morning, on the patio, every word. Jess froze. Mom's expression tightened. Brandon straightened in his chair. You were eavesdropping? In my own home? I asked. Where I was cooking a dinner you've picked apart all night? That's what you're upset about? That I heard you? There was a beat of silence so dense it seemed to bend the air. Danielle, my mom began, you don't understand how things were said. You're taking it out of context. Then please, I said, folding my arms, give me the right context for calling me useful but not lovable, or for funneling my money into Brandon's travel fund, or laughing about how easy it is to manipulate me. She blinked. Brandon shifted uncomfortably. Jess looked like she wanted to disappear. You've always been dramatic, Mom said, a little too sharply. Sensitive. That's not what we meant. That's the problem, I replied. You never mean it, but you always do it. I felt the moment shift, like something invisible had turned over in the room, the weight of truth, long avoided, now fully in the light. I looked at the table, at the beautiful china I'd purchased to impress a family who couldn't be bothered to look at me with real affection. "I spent 3 days preparing this dinner," I said softly, "weeks planning every detail, and not once did either of you ask how I was doing. Not once." No one answered. "I'm not the family's emergency fund anymore," I continued. "I'm not your safety net, and I'm not going to pretend I didn't hear what I heard just so you can feel comfortable again." Mom opened her mouth, but I held up a hand. "We'll talk later, or not, but tonight I'm done." After I walked out of the dining room, no one followed me. I half expected the usual, Mom calling after me with that carefully curated guilt, Brandon making some joke to lighten the mood. But the silence this time wasn't passive, it was calculating. I went to my office under the pretense of needing space, but mostly I needed to think clearly. The door was slightly ajar. I paused, uneasy. Inside, the desk lamp was still on. I hadn't left it that way. I stepped in and froze. There they were. My mother and Brandon standing over my filing cabinet, flipping through documents. Brandon was holding my investment portfolio. Mom had a Post-it note in her hand with the contact info for my accountant. They didn't even look surprised to see me. "Danielle," Mom said smoothly, like she hadn't just been rifling through my finances. "We were just looking for—" "An excuse?" I cut in. Brandon scoffed. "You're overreacting." "No," I said. "I'm finally reacting." My voice didn't shake this time. I walked in, took the file from Brandon's hand, and placed it back in the drawer. Slowly, calmly. "I invited you here to celebrate Christmas," I said, "not to audit my life." "You've been so closed off lately," Mom said, folding her arms. "We were concerned." "Concerned?" I repeated. "You mean curious, about what I have, what you might still get." The words weren't meant to wound, they were just the truth, and for the first time I wasn't afraid to say them. Brandon stepped forward. "You said you'd help with the next contractor payment. That's what family does." "No," I said. "That's what I've always done, without question, without conditions." I looked at both of them, the same faces I had spent my entire life trying to please. "I've poured tens of thousands of dollars into this family, covered Brandon's rent, paid Mom's car repairs, funded trips, renovations, tuition, birthdays." I felt something solidify inside me. "But not anymore." Mom's eyes narrowed. "Are you seriously cutting us off on Christmas?" I didn't flinch. "I'm setting boundaries. If that feels like punishment, that's not on me." Brandon muttered something under his breath, but I didn't ask him to repeat it. Because I didn't need his permission to protect myself anymore. Back in the living room, Jess and my friend Tasha, who had dropped by with dessert, were quietly gathering dishes. Tasha looked at me, her brow slightly raised. I gave a small nod. Her expression softened into something I hadn't seen all night. Genuine respect. I turned back to my family. "I'm not your provider. I'm not your backup plan. And I'm not afraid of walking away from people who only show up when they're hungry, for money or control." For once, no one had anything to say. And that silence? It didn't feel empty. It felt earned. I didn't sleep that night. Even after everyone left, Jess making polite excuses, Brandon slamming the guest room door, my mother pacing with one final sigh, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, heart pounding in my chest. But it wasn't fear anymore. It was clarity. Christmas morning arrived with a hush over Portland. The streets outside were quiet. A dusting of frost coated the sidewalks. And for once, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt earned. I slipped into the kitchen, brewed a pot of coffee, and stood by the same window that had shattered everything just the day before. But this time, I didn't feel broken. I felt awake. Brandon came down first, eyes bloodshot, likely from more than just lack of sleep. He didn't say good morning, just poured coffee and muttered something about the heat being too low. Then came Mom, fully dressed, as if she were headed to brunch with someone who still believed in her performances. "Good morning," she said with forced brightness. I nodded but didn't offer my usual Merry Christmas. Not today. We sat at the table over French toast and fruit. Tradition, hollow now. I waited, counting seconds until the conversation turned, like always, toward money. And right on cue, it did. "I spoke to the contractor," my mom said, dabbing her mouth with a linen napkin. "He's willing to resume next week if we can send over the next installment." Brandon jumped in. "And I found a studio rental that's perfect for the business. Only thing is, we need to lock it down soon. End-of-year rates." I didn't blink. "Great. You should both talk to your banks about a personal loan." My mother's fork paused mid-air. "Danielle?" "No," I said calmly. "We're not doing this again." "You promised." "I promised before I knew you were lying," I replied. "That promise is void." Brandon leaned back in his chair. "So you're just cutting us off?" "I'm finally choosing myself," I said. "And we're your family." "Exactly," I whispered. And it shouldn't have taken overhearing a conversation through a window to realize I never felt safe around you. Tasha arrived mid-morning, holding 2 coffees and a look of pure solidarity. She didn't need to say a word. Her presence was enough. When she glanced between me, Brandon, and my mom, I saw understanding pass between us, like she'd walked into the storm and already knew which direction the wind was blowing. I turned to my family. "You can stay until after lunch, but after that, I think it's best you leave." Mom stood up. Disbelief splashed across her face. "You're kicking us out? On Christmas?" "No," I said. "I'm closing the door on a version of myself I no longer want to be." The silence that followed wasn't explosive. It was a surrender. And for the first time in 35 years, I didn't feel like the villain for setting a boundary. I felt free. After lunch, I walked my mother and Brandon to the door. There were no hugs, no promises to call, just stiff shoulders, a few passive remarks, and a sense that none of us truly believed the silence would be temporary this time. And maybe, for the first time, I didn't want it to be. The moment the door clicked shut behind them, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding for 35 years. The house was quiet. Not the uncomfortable quiet that used to haunt me after every family gathering, but a stillness that felt like space. Space I had earned. Tasha and Jess stayed behind to help with the dishes. I didn't ask them to, but they did anyway. No expectations, no guilt. Just the kind of steady presence I hadn't realized I was starving for. "You okay?" Tasha finally asked as she dried the last wine glass. "No," I said honestly, "but I'm getting there." Later that evening, we sat around the living room, the Christmas tree twinkling in the corner, the wrapping paper still half scattered on the floor. We talked. We laughed a little. There were no elaborate gifts exchanged, just stories, warmth, and the kind of comfort that never asks you to perform. Paul, the guy I'd been seeing casually, sweet, grounded, a little awkward, showed up around 6 with takeout from my favorite Thai place. "I figured you'd be too emotionally exhausted to cook," he said, handing me the bag. I smiled for real for the first time all day. "You figured right." We ate on the couch with our legs tucked under us, sharing bites of pad thai and watching an old holiday movie neither of us cared about. It was the most unremarkable, perfect moment, because it was real. No manipulation, no performance, no trying to buy love, just quiet care. At some point, Paul looked over at me and said, "You know, what you did today? That was brave." I shook my head. It didn't feel brave. It felt overdue. "Still counts," he said gently. Tasha raised her glass. "To overdo things that finally get done." We clinked mugs. And for the first time, I didn't feel like a fraud in my own life. I felt like someone finally coming home to herself. The days after Christmas were quiet, strangely peaceful, like the kind of silence that used to feel threatening, but now just felt like a reset. There were no voicemails, No texts from Mom asking if I'd cooled off. No surprise visits from Brandon with a sheepish smile and another favor to ask. And for once, I didn't miss any of it. I spent the week decluttering. Not just drawers or closets, but expectations. I boxed up old birthday cards that always felt more obligatory than affectionate. I recycled a stack of receipts from years of covering emergencies that were never mine to fix. And I finally deleted the spreadsheet I'd been using to track every dollar I gave my family, as if keeping score was the only way to justify my hurt. It felt like shedding skin. Paul stopped by with groceries one evening. He didn't ask if I was okay. He just brought homemade soup and watched reruns with me until I laughed without realizing it. When I told him everything, really everything, he didn't try to fix it. He just held space. Sometimes healing doesn't look like therapy sessions or dramatic breakthroughs. Sometimes it looks like someone handing you a bowl of soup and saying, "You don't owe anyone an explanation." New Year's Eve came and went without the usual pressure. I didn't wear anything sparkly. I didn't attend any parties. I sat on my porch with Tasha, wrapped in blankets, watching fireworks over the Portland skyline. I used to believe family was about blood, I told her. She sipped her cider. And now? Now I think it's about behavior. Who shows up? Who listens? Who doesn't make love a transaction? She nodded. Took you long enough? We laughed. Not the bitter laugh I'd known for years, but a full-bodied one that started deep in my chest. In January, I started therapy. At first, I wasn't sure what to say. I was so used to narrating my life to people who only half listened that I didn't know what it felt like to be fully heard. But slowly, session by session, I stopped defending my pain. I started honoring it. Not everything got easier, but I started sleeping better, breathing easier, smiling at myself in the mirror, not because I had to, but because something inside me was quietly healing. By February, I'd made a decision. The money I would have poured into my family's next demand, I invested it into a small side project I'd always wanted to start, a financial literacy workshop for young women navigating toxic family dynamics. Because if I could stop even one person from becoming a silent provider for people who never truly saw her, it would be worth it. This time, I wasn't giving to be accepted. I was giving from a place of strength. And for the first time, I realized I wasn't rebuilding the life they broke. I was building the one I deserved. It happened on a Tuesday morning, ordinary, gray-skied, coffee in hand kind of Tuesday. I had just wrapped up a video call with one of my workshop partners when my phone lit up. Mom. One new message. I stared at the screen for a long moment, thumb hovering but not quite ready to tap. We hadn't spoken since Christmas. Not a word. Not a Happy New Year. Not a passive-aggressive meme. Just silence. And now, this. Curiosity got the better of me. Danielle, I heard about the classes you're teaching. I didn't realize you were turning our personal business into a public spectacle. I hope this isn't how you intend to make a name for yourself. No greeting. No warmth. Just judgment dressed as concern. I read it again, slower this time, letting the weight of her words sink in. Not once had she asked how I was. Not once had she acknowledged the pain I voiced or the boundaries I set. This wasn't reconciliation. This was control. I sat down at the kitchen table and stared out the window, the same one where everything began unraveling weeks ago. The old version of me would have crafted a careful reply, something neutral, respectful, professional, even. I used to bend over backwards trying to keep the peace, even when I was the only one bleeding. But I wasn't that woman anymore. Not fully. Not today. I took a breath, typed 3 words. I don't owe you, then deleted them, not because they weren't true, but because I realized I didn't even need to respond. Silence could be an answer too. And sometimes, the loudest form of healing is choosing not to explain yourself anymore. That night, I shared the message with Tasha and Paul. We sat around the table, laughter flickering between sips of tea and silent nods of understanding. She's trying to bait you, Tasha said. Paul added, "People who lose control over you will always accuse you of betrayal, especially when your truth makes them uncomfortable." I looked at both of them, grateful beyond words. "I'm done chasing clarity from people who benefit from my confusion," I whispered. I turned off my phone that night, not out of anger, but protection. Because every time I let her voice back in, I felt myself shrinking again, apologizing for things I should have never carried. And I was tired, so deeply tired, of abandoning myself just to keep a door open that only ever let the cold in. Letting go doesn't always mean burning bridges. Sometimes it means walking away from one you've crossed too many times alone. 2 days after that text from my mother, Brandon emailed me. Not a joke, not a guilt trip, not a request for money. Just a subject line that said, "Can we talk?" And underneath it, one line. "I don't want to defend what happened. I just want to meet you where you are, if that's still possible." It was the first time in years I'd seen a sentence from him without spin. No inflated ideas, no excuses, no, "but you have to understand," just stillness. I stared at the email for nearly an hour. I kept hearing Paul's voice in my head. "People who lose control will call your boundaries betrayal." But this didn't feel like control. Not yet. It felt different. Still, I was cautious. I called Tasha that night. "He wants to meet," I said, pacing my living room, the words heavy in my mouth. "He didn't make demands. He just asked." She didn't interrupt, just let me talk it out. "I don't know if I'm ready," I continued, "but I also don't know if closing the door without checking feels right either." Tasha exhaled. "There's a difference between keeping the door cracked and letting someone walk through without knocking." So I replied, "I'll meet you. 1 hour, public place, no apologies, just honesty." We agreed on a small coffee shop near Powell's bookstore, neutral ground where I used to grade papers back when I was teaching evening business classes. I chose a window seat, showed up 10 minutes early, ordered chamomile tea because my stomach was already on edge. And when he walked in, I didn't flinch. Brandon looked older than I remembered. Maybe it was the stress, or maybe I was finally seeing him without the filter of old sibling loyalty. He sat down, hands in his lap. No laptop, no props, no distractions. "I don't expect anything from you," he said first. "Not money, not forgiveness. He paused. "I think I finally heard you, Danielle. Not through Mom. Not through the stories we always told ourselves. Just you." I didn't speak. Not at first, because I needed to feel it. Not just the apology. The energy behind it. "I never said anything before because I was afraid," he went on. "Afraid you'd pull away if I admitted how much you carried for us. Afraid I'd have to face what that meant about me." His voice cracked, just barely. "And I guess I'm finally tired of pretending I was ever the generous one in this family." I felt something shift in me. Not forgiveness, but recognition. He had, for the first time, looked me in the eye and stood in front of the wreckage instead of pretending it didn't exist. And sometimes, that's the beginning of everything. After Brandon left the cafe, I stayed behind. My tea had long gone cold, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I just sat there, watching people stroll past the windows, their coats wrapped tight against Portland's winter wind. The truth is, I didn't know what to feel. There was no yelling, no dramatics, no rehearsed guilt trips or desperate bargaining. Just him, sitting in front of me, quietly owning the role he'd played in my unraveling. And I'd waited years, decades, for someone in my family to do that. So why did I still feel like I was holding my breath? That night, I curled up on the couch with a blanket and my journal, the pages half filled with notes from therapy, stray thoughts from quiet mornings, and questions I never dared speak out loud. At the top of a fresh page, I wrote, "Can you forgive someone without letting them back in?" It stared at me like it already knew the answer. I didn't call Brandon. I didn't send a follow-up text. I needed space to feel what was mine, to grieve not just the betrayal, but the versions of us I had to bury to protect myself. Letting go wasn't a one-time event. It was daily, sometimes hourly, a quiet decision to not go back, even when the past knocks with a softer voice. Paul came by later with those ridiculous caramel brownies I love. He didn't ask what happened, just handed me a plate and said, "Want to eat and talk about absolutely nothing?" I laughed. God, yes. And for a while, that was enough. The next morning, I woke up lighter, still cautious, still tender, but something had shifted. I didn't owe Brandon or anyone else access to my healing just because they finally saw the fire they helped start, but I could still be proud of the woman I was becoming in the ashes. Later that week, I finalized the outline for the next workshop. The theme? Boundaries are bridges to self. Not walls, not cages, just choices that protect the version of you that took too long to find. Some people saw my classes as radical. I didn't. They were just reminders that we're allowed to stop bleeding for people who never offered a bandage, that family isn't who raised you, it's who rises with you, and that choosing peace doesn't mean shutting every door, just the ones you've walked through alone for far too long. It had been 3 weeks since I saw Brandon. No word, no pressure, just quiet. I was beginning to believe that maybe this chapter had really, finally turned. Until the letter came. Not an email, not a text, a handwritten letter. Thick envelope, elegant cursive across the front. My mother's handwriting. I stood at the mailbox with it in my hands, heart thudding, fingers cold from the Portland air. For a moment, I debated tossing it straight into the recycling bin. But curiosity, the soft, stubborn echo of a daughter still wanting something from her mother, won out. I opened it on the kitchen counter. No dear Danielle, no apologies, just this. I've been thinking a lot about Christmas, about the things that were said. I may not agree with your choices, but I suppose I owe you the chance to explain them. I'll be at Montclair Cafe on Saturday at 2 p.m. If you want to talk, you know where to find me. No warmth, no accountability, just veiled condescension dressed up as invitation. Still, I felt the old pull, like a muscle memory. The urge to fix, to be the bigger person, to take crumbs and call them dinner. I showed the letter to Paul that evening. "She wants to meet," I said, voice flat. He read the note in silence, jaw tightening. "What do you think you'll get from it?" he finally asked. "Closure," I said, but even I didn't believe it. He nodded slowly. "Just don't confuse opportunity with obligation." Saturday came. I drove past Montclair Cafe twice, circling the block like I was 12 again and afraid to disappoint her. I parked, sat with the engine running. My phone buzzed. Tasha checking in. "You don't have to go in, babe. That version of you doesn't live there anymore." And yet, I stepped out. Not for her. For me. She was already there, of course. Polished, lipstick perfect, back straight, like she was waiting for an employee review, not a conversation with her daughter. "Danielle," she said with a tight smile. "Right on time." I didn't return the pleasantry. She got straight to it. "I've been speaking with Brandon. He seems to think you're transforming." The way she said it made it sound like a phase, like bangs or a bad tattoo. I didn't respond. She stirred her tea. "I suppose I just don't understand where this sudden rebellion came from." "It's not rebellion," I said. "It's remembering I'm allowed to say no." She blinked, slowly. "You've changed." "I've healed," I replied. "There's a difference." And in that moment I realized I hadn't come here to explain, or to fix, or even to forgive. I came to see, with my own eyes, whether she was willing to meet me on new ground. And the answer was already clear. I stood to leave. "You're walking away again?" she asked. "No," I said softly. "I'm choosing myself. That's not walking away. That's walking toward something better." The door didn't slam when I left Montclair Cafe. There was no dramatic exit, no final line meant to sting. Just the quiet click of glass closing behind me and the slow exhale of a chapter ending. And strangely, I didn't feel angry. I felt free. For weeks I had been holding space, for grief, for memory, for the hope that someone in my family might meet me where I stood now. Brandon tried. My mother couldn't. And that, finally, was okay. I drove straight to the community center after that meeting, where our next financial literacy workshop was set to begin. I walked in, still wearing the same coat, still feeling the cold in my bones, but something inside me was burning steady. The room was already filling. Young women, some barely out of college, others holding babies on their hips, scribbled notes, passed worksheets, smiled nervously at one another. One of them approached me shyly. "You're Danielle, right?" I nodded. She held up a worn notebook. "I've been following your sessions online. They've helped me set boundaries with my dad for the first time in years." I smiled, not out of pride, but recognition. "I'm glad," I said. "You deserve peace and safety, not just survival." That night, after the session ended, I stood at the front of the empty classroom and looked at the whiteboard where I had written the words, "You are not selfish for protecting your sanity." It hit me then. How many years I had spent thinking love meant sacrifice. That being the good daughter meant abandoning myself quietly. That if I just gave enough, proved enough, bent enough, maybe then I would earn unconditional love. But love that demands your silence isn't love. It's control dressed in family ties. Later, I met Paul at our favorite spot near Hawthorne Bridge. He brought 2 mugs of chai and a question in his eyes. "How'd it go?" I didn't need to explain. I just leaned into him, warm mug in hand, and whispered, "I didn't lose anything. I reclaimed everything." That weekend, I rewrote my will. Not because I had much to leave behind, but because for the first time, I knew exactly who deserved my legacy. Not by blood, but by presence, by truth, by care. I named Tasha as my medical proxy. I listed Paul under emergency contacts, and under next of kin, I simply wrote, "Chosen family," because family isn't who breaks you and demands repair. It's who sits beside you in silence, waiting until you're strong enough to speak again. March came in like rain and stayed that way for weeks. But I didn't mind. Something about the gray skies felt like a mirror, subtle, reflective, honest. I wasn't rebuilding anymore. I was building forward. The financial workshops had grown. What started as 5 women in a cramped room with secondhand folding chairs had turned into a full-blown community initiative. Now we had speakers, sponsors, childcare during sessions, and most importantly, stories, shared aloud, sometimes trembling, sometimes angry, always brave. I wasn't the only one who had lived in silence too long, and I wasn't the only one finally learning how to say, "No more." I still had moments of doubt, mostly late at night, when the house was too quiet and old voices tried to crawl back in, but now I knew how to answer them, not with guilt, with truth. You are allowed to grow beyond the story they gave you. One afternoon, Paul and I walked through Laurelhurst Park, hands brushing, the air thick with early spring and wet leaves. He turned to me, mid-sentence, and said, "You know, you light up when you talk about this work. It's like watching someone step into sunlight." I stopped walking, because I felt it too. For so long, I had been trying to prove I wasn't broken, trying to patch wounds with productivity, to earn worth through sacrifice. But now, I was just living. At home, I printed out a new sign and taped it above my desk. "You don't owe survival to anyone who contributed to your drowning." And below it, in my own handwriting, "But you do owe yourself the freedom to rise." My mother never reached out again. And strangely, I didn't feel abandoned. I felt released. It wasn't closure that saved me. It was choice. The next time someone asked about my family, I didn't stumble or shrink. I said, "My family is small, intentional, and full of love. The rest is just where I come from." And I meant it. We don't get to choose where we start, but we do get to choose what we carry. And for the first time in my life, I was finally carrying me. By April, the idea had become real. What started as a passing suggestion from Tasha over coffee had grown into something much bigger. A community summit. Not a lecture, not a webinar, but a real in-person gathering. A space for women who'd carried too much for too long to lay it all down and begin again. We called it Unlearn to Rise. I remember the morning of the event like it's still unfolding. I stood behind the curtains at the Portland Women's Collective, listening to the soft hum of conversation filling the room. Nearly 70 people had shown up, some local, some from other cities, all carrying stories they weren't afraid to share anymore. I looked down at my hands. They weren't shaking. That surprised me. Tasha caught my eye from the front row and gave me a nod, the kind only someone who's witnessed your deepest unraveling can give. Paul was in the back, recording, but more importantly, rooting. His presence always felt like a hand between my shoulder blades, steady, unspoken. When they introduced me as keynote speaker, I stepped onto the stage and took a breath that reached down into a version of myself I no longer lived in, but still honored. "I'm Danielle Brooks," I began, voice steady but warm. And for most of my life, I confused silence with peace. I thought being the strong one meant never needing, never breaking, never asking to be seen. The room quieted. "But I've learned," I continued, "that strength isn't about how much you carry. It's about how willing you are to finally put it down." I spoke for 20 minutes, not from notes, not from slides, just from memory, from marrow. I talked about the weight of obligation, the myths of unconditional love, the grief of choosing yourself, and the quiet, beautiful rage of rebuilding on your own terms. And when I finished, no one clapped right away. They stood, in silence, until the tears came, then the applause. Later that afternoon, I stepped outside for air and found a woman sitting on the curb, wiping her eyes. She looked up, startled. "Sorry, I didn't mean to cry like this." I sat beside her. "That's what today's for," she exhaled. "I left a family dinner last week and never went back. I thought I was being dramatic, but now, I think I was saving myself." I didn't need to say anything. She already knew. This summit wasn't just an event. It was a mirror, a declaration, a soft rebellion whispered loudly, and for the first time, I wasn't asking the world to listen because I was hurting. I was asking because I had healed. The week after the summit, I received a message from a university in Seattle. They were launching a mentorship program for first-generation female students, young women navigating finances, expectations, and identity all at once. They asked if I would consider becoming one of their keynote mentors. I didn't hesitate. Driving up I-5 that Friday morning felt different than any trip I'd taken before. It wasn't about escape this time. It wasn't even about proving anything. It was about offering a hand from the other side of the storm. The campus buzzed with energy, backpacks swinging, coffee cups clutched tight, students laughing through stress. I stepped into the auditorium and saw rows of faces that reminded me of younger versions of myself, hopeful, driven, quietly exhausted. One student, Camila, approached me after the session. "I'm trying to be everything for everyone," she said, tears caught in her throat. "My family back home depends on me, and I'm scared that if I say no, they'll stop loving me." I held her hand gently. "I know that fear," I said. "It lives deep, but love that asks you to disappear isn't love. It's debt." Her shoulders dropped, like she'd been waiting years for someone to name it. Back in Portland, I started writing more, not just for workshops, but for me. Late nights at my desk, rain tapping the windows, I poured pages of reflection, guidance, memory. I wasn't just healing anymore, I was documenting the map, so others wouldn't have to walk blind through the fire, Paul called it my legacy, but I didn't want monuments. I wanted echoes, conversations passed between sisters and friends, boundaries drawn without shame, apologies not accepted just because they arrived late. That's the kind of inheritance I believed in now. Tasha and I co-founded a foundation 2 months later, Reclaim and Rise, grants for women walking away from toxic homes, scholarships for those estranged from their families, retreats that felt more like reunions of the soul. The first check we wrote was for a woman named Naomi. She said, "No one's ever believed me before, let alone backed it with money." We did, because I knew what it felt like to be gaslit by your own blood. This wasn't revenge, it wasn't rebellion, it was reclamation. And with every name we added to the ledger, every voice that rose, I felt it. A legacy not built on what I lost, but on what I finally chose to keep. I'm Danielle Brooks, and if you've followed me this far, thank you. For listening, for feeling, for staying. It's hard to explain what it means to stand on the other side of a life you once thought would break you. Some days, it still catches me off guard. The quiet, the peace, the absence of apology. I used to think healing would come with trumpets, that it would arrive all at once, triumphant and final. But it didn't. It came slowly, in the small decisions, in every no that protected my energy, in every boundary that honored my worth. I no longer flinch when the phone rings. I don't sit by the window wondering if someone will finally show up and love me the way I needed, because I showed up for myself. And that counts. Here's what I've learned, and maybe it's something you need to hear too. You're allowed to leave a story that keeps wounding you. You're allowed to stop explaining your pain to people committed to misunderstanding it. You're allowed to define family not by blood, but by safety, by honesty, by reciprocity. There's no award for being the most self-sacrificing, no medal for enduring what broke you, but there is freedom, and that freedom is yours. Even if it feels unfamiliar at first, I built a life out of pieces they thought were disposable, and it's beautiful, not because it's perfect, but because it's mine. So if you're listening to this and wondering if it's too late, it's not. Your second act doesn't begin when they forgive you. It begins the moment you stop needing them to. Let them wonder how you're doing. Let them miss the version of you who always gave in. You're too busy writing new chapters. If this journey gave you something real, courage, clarity, or even just a breath of relief, please don't forget to subscribe, like, share, and comment. You never know who's listening in the silence, waiting to feel seen.